My name is Pauline Rankin. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. And let me begin with an acknowledgement that we live, gather, and organize on the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. Carleton acknowledges that it has a responsibility to the Algonquin people and a responsibility to adhere to Algonquin cultural protocols. Now, our aspiration for this Healthy City series is to explore the many factors that contribute to making urban centers healthy and livable for everyone. And tonight's event, Imagining a Just City, features a really remarkable group of moderators and panelists, each from very distinct professional backgrounds. And although this evening's speakers possess an array of talents and knowledge, I suspect that they share a fundamental commonality, and that is that each one of them is committed to challenging injustices and ending oppression of all kinds. Our discussion tonight brings together these experts to ask the critical question: what needs changing, reimagining, unsettling, and remaking to realize a just city? I'd like to thank our panelists in advance for their generous flexibility and for taking part in this virtual conversation. We wish we were meeting in person, but we're very glad that you're here this way. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight in the audience, and warmest thanks to the organizers who have worked to connect us and to continue this series despite lots of challenges. In particular, our communications team in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and Bowker, and our guest organizer tonight and friend, Jill Weigel from the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. I will now turn it over to our moderators, feminist labor lawyer and human rights advocate, Patricia Harewood, and executive director of the City for All Women Initiative, and Carleton graduate, Dr. Valerie Stam.
Thank you so much, Pauline, and thank you for having us here tonight, and thank you to FASS for organizing this lecture series. So yes, I'm Valerie Stam, and as Pauline said, a recent Carleton grad. I just got my PhD in sociology. I'm now the executive director of CAWI, the City for All Women Initiative. And CAWI is a collaboration between women and gender diverse people from academia, civil society, and the grassroots. And we work together to advance gender equity and make the city a more equitable and inclusive place. I will pass it now to Patricia, my co-moderator.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Patricia Harewood, and I am a labor lawyer. I work at the Public Service Alliance of Canada. And in my spare time, I love to work with organizations and individuals that are advancing social change, racial equity, and gender justice. And I'm here also in my capacity as a board member of the City for All Women Initiative. So it gives me great pleasure to be with you here today with our distinguished panelists. And you may hear screaming in the background at times. I can assure you the children are fine. But that's sort of all part of our new reality, our COVID reality for now and in the coming months as well. So I'm just going to turn now to what is in store for tonight. As you know, this past year, in 2020 at least, it has become more apparent rather, how important it is to create justice cities. COVID has really revealed to many of us the cracks that exist in our society, the fissures. We need to create just societies and just cities which emphasize creating communities of care, healthy neighborhoods, and neighborhoods with gender and racial justice.
With the onset of COVID, CAWI has been focused on developing a gendered recovery plan for all, and we're pleased to say this is the first intersectional feminist recovery plan in Canada to provide recommendations to the municipal level. We see cities as a microcosm of our greater society and the complex and interconnected inequalities that exist in our society. We're now working with feminist organizations in other municipalities who are inspired by this work. In addition, COVID, as well as the murder of George Floyd, also brought to the fore how racialized bodies are policed differently and more violently than white bodies. This has become a prominent focus of CAWI's work this past year, and we will continue to advocate for gender and racial justice in policing. We also worked closely with the city's planning department recently to integrate equity and inclusion into planning in a stronger way. So all of these topics come together in tonight's panel on the Just City. This panel will engage ideas, actions, and practices related to housing for people and not for profit, caring communities, and feminist, anti-colonial, and anti-racist planning and city making in Ottawa in times of COVID-19 and beyond.
Now, Pauline mentioned at the beginning that we have distinguished panelists, and indeed we do. And I now have the pleasure of introducing our panelists. And I'm going to start with, just get to my script.
Shall I jump in, Patricia?
I think you should.
All right.
You should jump in.
So let's start with introducing Julie. Julie Tomiak is an interdisciplinary researcher of mixed Anishinaabe and European descent who studies Indigenous resurgence, decolonization, and cities. She is an associate professor in the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies at Carleton. Welcome, Julie. Hayley Millington is a federal public service employee and an activist who is currently serving as the Union of National Employees, the national equity representative for its racialized members. She is also a past co-chair of the Racially Visible Action Committee, and she sits on her Housing Co-op's board of directors as its president. Naini Clouthier is the executive director of the Somerset West Community Health Centre in Ottawa. She has more than 20 years of experience working in the community health centre sector, focusing on health equity, community development, health promotion, and advocacy issues. And finally, Ifrah Yusuf is the co-chair of the Justice for Abdirahman Coalition, an Ottawa-based group made up of primarily young Black activists. The objective of this campaign is to obtain greater transparency, challenge racial inequity, and bring an end to bureaucratic processes that obstruct justice for the late Abdirahman Abdi. Thank you to all of you for being here tonight and welcome. We look forward to this conversation.
And thank you, Valerie, for taking over there. What one finds sometimes is that there's really a benefit to co-moderation, and collaboration. So we're going to start with a number of really some incredible questions, but I'm going to start with this one to really all of the panelists. And the question is, what needs changing, reimagining, remaking, and unsettling for a just city? And I'm going to repeat the question, but before I do that, I do just want to underline that we do have sign language interpretation today. And so we're being asked to speak, obviously, more slowly to accommodate the benefit of having this interpretation. So again, I'll just repeat: what needs changing, reimagining, remaking, and unsettling for a just city? Each panelist has 5 minutes to respond to the question, and we can begin with Julie and then go on to Hayley, Naini, and Ifrah.
Thanks. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to participate tonight. I'm really looking forward to my co-panelists' responses to this question and to just learning more about their work and visions for a just city and a just Ottawa. I returned to Ottawa from Toronto 2 years ago, but before I lived in the city while I was doing my PhD at Carleton after moving here in 2004 from Berlin. But I have ancestral connections to Algonquin territory and families through my mother's side. My mother grew up in the Swisha on an island in the Kichisibi between Pembroke and Mattawa. So this last year highlighted the urgency, as we've already heard, to reimagine cities and to confront the inequalities and relations of violence that shape life for many people Black and Indigenous people in particular. So going back to normal after the pandemic doesn't hold the same appeal and promise for everyone. Part of the world making of cities in North America has been the production and exploitation of racial hierarchies and vulnerability to premature death, to paraphrase Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism. Normal then means dispossession, food insecurity, housing insecurity, and different forms of violence, including state violence for BIPOC residents. Nick Estes reminds us that the settler colonial common sense is always an anti-Indigenous common sense, and it's baked into how cities are known, designed, and governed, and how care is conceptualized. What needs changing, reimagining, unsettling, and remaking for a just city is a big question, and probably, I think it's safe to say, too big for a 5-minute answer. It requires a very long and probably many answers. But one of the obvious answers is land back, giving life and material consequences to the acknowledgement that we are on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory would radically change and reimagine the city, and not just the city. Land back has been a persistent focus of Indigenous struggles. In the red paper of the same title, Hayden King and Shiri Pasternak stressed that, quote, one of the loudest and most frequent demands of Indigenous people in the relationship with settlers is the return of the land, end of quote. And cities are, of course, on land. Yet cities continue to be imagined as settler space, as new, modern, as somehow outside of violent colonial logics of dispossession and disappearance. A just city makes it possible for Indigenous people to maintain and restore relationships and governing authority within legal orders that are informed by the land itself. In this sense, land back is about more than ownership and jurisdiction. Understanding the city as land and as Indigenous land would be transformative in many ways. As Len Coulthard writes in relation to the Indigenous struggle for land, it's, quote, a struggle not only for land in the material sense, but also deeply informed by what the land as system of reciprocal relations and obligations can teach us about living our lives in relation to one another and the natural world in non-dominating and non-exploitative terms, end of quote. A city, any city exists in context. Currently, this context is shaped by structural relationships that dispossess, oppress, and exploit. To think about the city in relational ways means seeing it as part of a web of relations and connected to land, water, and human and non-human life far beyond the physical boundaries of the city. Therefore, justice in the city must mean justice everywhere, a remaking across all scales and processes that constitute the city in order to end settler colonialism, to end white supremacy, to end capitalism, and to end heteropatriarchy. This remaking would center Indigenous life, futurity, consent, and care, including responsibilities to ancestors and future generations, as well as to all human and non-human life. A city committed to justice and liberation for all is a decolonial, feminist, anti-racist, and anti-capitalist city that ensures everyone's access to and control over the means of life. Local Indigenous, and I should really stress diverse local Indigenous communities and the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation as the host nation have been doing this work of unsettling, of remaking Ottawa. In looking at Indigenous resurgence and city making, I think it's important to also be mindful of the fact that these practices of nation building and community building are not mutually exclusive and are also not contained by the city. So I just want to highlight a couple of examples, beginning with how local Indigenous organizations like Wabano, Minwashin, TI, and others are making a difference in the lives of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit residents by providing Indigenous-led programs and services and safe spaces, spaces that also reflect the diversity of the communities. They also, both individually and collectively, have been giving voice to the needs and priorities of Indigenous people in the city, including in the areas of housing, health and mental health, and of course, connection to community and connection to culture. When I talked to one of the leaders who's been involved in advancing the Algonquin land claim, they stressed the goals to create more Algonquin visibility in public space, and so in the built environment in Ottawa, and a presence for Anishinaabe. They also mentioned how important it would be to extend programs and services into the city. And I think all of these priorities would do some important work of de-essentializing categories and breaking down binaries such as city and reserve, and city and non-city. And just to quickly recap, a just city centers Indigenous relationships with the land and supports Indigenous initiatives on the terms of communities and nations. These initiatives include institution building and governance, land and water protection, care infrastructures, non-police community safety, languages and arts, among many others. It's the kind of city that, as Heather Duries points out, would, quote, offer solutions that foreground the flourishing of Indigenous life, end of quote. And the flourishing of Indigenous life and all life is, of course, sustained by the land, to bring it back to my original point. And I know that my 5 minutes are probably up already, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julie, for such a comprehensive and thoughtful response. And thanks also for talking about your connection to the land. I think often we don't do that. And, you know, I appreciate you acknowledging that a just city is one that is feminist and anti-capitalist and anti-racist, and one that really allows Indigenous life to flourish, but also, as you said, non-human life to also flourish. So with that response, can we hear from Hayley on what needs changing, reimagining, remaking, and unsettling for a just city from your perspective, Hayley, after hearing what Julie has contributed as well to the conversation?
First off, I'd like to thank CAWI for the opportunity to sit with a wonderful group of panelists to have this ever important discussion. And I'd like to thank everyone who actually logged on to have a listen and to get some different perspectives on what is really happening within this great city of ours. So first off, again, they introduced me. So my name is Hayley Millington. I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago, and I've been living in Canada for too long to mention, I believe. So I'll get right on it. So as we know, yesterday was Martin Luther King Day. And I believe Martin put it quite succinctly when he said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent on things that matter. And I think this is one of the greatest quotes because it really does address the ideas of what is actually happening within our city. I think for so long, we have imagined our city to be some type of visionary place. And unfortunately, with the onset of this worldwide pandemic, we have really realized the shortfalls, the nearsightedness, and the ill preparedness of not only our governments, but really of our peoples at large, because no one could foresee this coming. And of course, you can never be prepared for something like this. So when it comes to changing, I think what needs to change is the way in which we approach and the way in which we do things. I think it's time for us to really take a hard and fast look at our institutions, our structures, the way we interact with each other, and really the way we perceive the structures that are already in place. As Julie mentioned, the way we approach Aboriginal and Indigenous issues. I think, of course, that's something that really needs clear and concise and real conversations. I believe these need to change, the way in which we converse, what we're speaking about. Most times, people find it really difficult to speak to the hard conversations. For instance, as we all saw last year with the worldwide event, I call it, of the killing of Mr. George Floyd, where we all were wrapped to our television screen as we watched this man lose his life. And I think in that perspective, that became a difficult, watching it seemed an easy thing. You're watching something on television, but really the conversation behind that is a difficult one for many people to have, because most of us would rather live in our bubbles and have the idea that this doesn't happen to us. This doesn't happen here in Ottawa. Well, I can tell you it does, maybe to not the extent that we saw in the US, but you certainly have forms of it right here in our great city. So I think with regards to change, it really is all about in how we're continuing to interact, really looking carefully at our institutions. Systemic racism is rampant. And we need to have those conversations with the people who matter at the table. So we need to see inclusivity. We need to bring the voices of those who don't necessarily have a voice, who may not be invited to that table to actually speak. I think until we start bringing everyone together to have those type of conversations, then we will be lacking on how we go about replacing our structures, how we revisit our processes. These things cannot be rebuilt or reimagined unless we have the input of those around us, those groups, those that are suffering disparities, inequalities. We need to have them at the table, because it's only then can we have a better picture, a full picture of really what we will need to reimagine our city in order to have the type of city that is not only prepared for pandemic-like proportions, but a city that is prepared to be genuinely welcoming and equal to everyone who exists within its confines. There's another quote that sits on the tip of my tongue that states, "Be the change you want to see." And it is so evident that if we as individuals or governments or municipalities really are committed to having that vision, really committed to the task at hand, prepared to have those difficult conversations, do what needs to be done, I think our city, as it rebuilds and it recovers, we're going to see exactly the change that we're all hoping to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayley. Oh. Thank you, Hayley. That was very inspiring. I appreciate the quotes you bring in, and also your reminder and your call for us to all bring voices to the table who normally don't have a voice, so that we can really break with what's been happening in the past and reimagine and creatively reimagine a new way forward. Now we'll turn to Naini Clouthier, and the question again, I will pose it, is what needs changing, reimagining, remaking, and unsettling for a just city?
Well, thank you very much. It was great to hear the earlier speakers, and to me, I feel I'm among my people when being part of this panel. So thank you, and really appreciate all those who are present for the conversation as well after long, busy days on Zoom. So I guess for me, from the frontline experiences in the healthcare and social services system, I would say that a city is not just when certain groups are disproportionately impacted by a pandemic and other health conditions. For example, we know that the Black community and racialized communities are disproportionately impacted. So are those who are homeless and other groups that are marginalized. And it's not a just city when you have frontline workers who are not only working in, for example, long-term care by day and sleeping in a shelter by night. And there are so many precarious workers in precarious situations, personal support workers living in the city shelter system. And certainly the city is not just when you have over 8,000 unique individuals living in emergency shelters, when you have homeless people on the streets in freezing conditions, living in tents. And there's been a steady rise in family homelessness over the past 5 years. People are lining up for food or choosing to pay between rent and getting basic necessities. And there are people in our community who are living in very small spaces, spaces that are really not habitable and infested with, for example, bed bugs. So what could this just city look like? So when our premier asks that everyone stay home, it would be a just city when everyone would have a home to stay in. And instead of trying to fix people, and instead of trying to have short-term fixes, we focus on doing things like fixing things like housing, poverty, systemic racism, oppression, safer drugs, and where the city puts people over economic considerations. So investing in sustainable funding, community social services, and where everyone matters, whether you can pay taxes or not. And where we focus on a preventative and community approach instead of a reactive approach when it becomes a crisis. So that the response to mental health and addictions is not in our emergency departments and hospitals. And it is very sad that since 2006, there's been a 50% increase in visits to the emergency department for mental health. And with adequate supports, these situations could be addressed in the community through diverse programs such as counseling, harm reduction efforts, creating conditions of belonging. A just city is where there is transportation, which is accessible and affordable, and there are different modes of transportation are supported. We want our power holders, such as the police, healthcare systems, politicians, to challenge implicit racial biases, as has been talked about by the previous speakers, to confront colonialism and create anti-oppressive frameworks. And again, what was talked about earlier, amplify the leadership, the insights, and the lived experience of racialized communities. And where the community voices are incorporated into all decision-making, especially those facing the greatest barriers to access, because they are the ones who are most impacted when there are policies that are unjust. Finally, I'd like to just speak briefly to a project that Somerset West undertook in the Ottawa West Centertown community, which is rapidly gentrifying. And it is forcing residents, especially those who are racialized, people who are homeless, people who are precariously housed, and forcing them out. And here, rooming houses have been shut or resold. New large construction projects are gearing up to upper income homeowners and condo dwellers. And we spoke to almost 500 residents, and they all named affordable housing, accessible health and social services, where everyone felt valued and connected, free accessible public spaces for social connections. And you don't have a just city when people don't have a place where they can come, or where they feel welcome, they can come to spaces. And there are not many spaces that are welcoming, unfortunately. Where a just city would be where businesses that serve low, modest income clientele, and where you can retain ethnocultural communities and equitable access to healthy food, And these were long conversations we had in the community. And a large number of the people were those who were struggling. So I think in final note, I would say that a just city is a place where, as earlier was said, everyone feels they belong, and where everyone feels that they're cared for and they count. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your insightful comments, Naini, from the perspective where you sit at Somerset Community Health Care Center and the realities of people in our community that you see on a daily basis. Thanks also for addressing the issue around mental health and the fact that we do live in a city where people do not have access to mental health services, which is something that is so desperately needed in this moment. And so, you know, we don't, according to your comments and the comments that we're hearing from Hayley and Julie, obviously we don't have that just city. We don't have that city which centers and values everyone and respects everyone and allows really everyone to live in dignity. I mean, the example of a precarious worker going to a shelter, or that of somebody who is at risk or homeless, not being able to shelter in place. I think those are particularly instructive. So we see the conversation here developing, and I'm now turning to Ifrah to ask you, from your perspective, from the work that you've done in the community, what needs changing, reimagining, remaking, and unsettling for a just city?
Thank you, Patricia. And I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you for the organizers who reached out to me for this important event and conversation. And I'd like to also thank my co-panelists who brought very good points to the table. Well, my meaning of a just city would have to be where Black, Indigenous, and other racialized communities feel safe, specifically from police. When it comes to policing, we need to see a lot of restructuring, a lot of changes, and a new way on policing. And how I see that happening is really from the tone of the top. So those who hold the police accountable and those who are holding an authority on top of the police, which are our politicians, our local leaders, we really need them to step up and see a new restructuring in their system in order to keep Black, Indigenous, and racialized people in mind when it comes to interactions with the police. We currently see a huge distrust between the police and the community. And we know as politicians, they are here to serve the community that voted for them, as well as police. The police is here to protect and serve. So it all comes back to what the community wants and needs. And we need the politicians and our city councilors, our mayors, and all of those politicians to really look at what the community wants. So here in Ottawa, we had a huge turnout at the last police board meeting, which was held in early December, I believe, around November, December time, which became an overwhelming stance from the community that they want to freeze the police budget for the next year. We saw many incidents here in the city where marginalized communities do not feel safe in the hands of police. We saw the death of Abdurrahman Abdi. We saw the death of Anthony Ouse recently, and we also saw the death of Greg Ritchie, all in the hands of Ottawa police. The community came out and showed their stance against the increase of police budget, and the police board indeed voted for the police budget to be increased. So we need to see that the politicians that we vote in, that we want to hold accountable, and who are there for us to really listen and learn and actively listen to what the community wants and needs, and they need to restructure their system based on what the community wants and needs from them to hold the police accountable at the end of the day. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Ifrah. It's truly inspiring to see all the work that the Justice for Abdirahman Coalition's been doing over the past, I guess it's been 4 years now, 5 years almost. And I just want to thank you all for all the hard work you've been doing in the community and the attention that you're bringing to these really important issues. We're going to turn now to a second round of more specific questions for each panelist. But during this time, we are hoping to have some questions from the audience after this round. And so if, as people are talking, you have questions, I encourage you to write them in the chat box. And Patricia and I will be taking note of them and fielding some of them after this round of questions. So we're going to go in reverse order this time. So we're going to start once again with you, Ifrah, and I think this question builds on what you were just talking about. We know that Black and Indigenous communities in Ottawa and in cities across North America are disproportionately and violently targeted, over policed, and charged by police and the judicial system. I'm wondering, when you think about a safe city or a just city for Black and Indigenous people, what does it look like? Can you take us there on a visual journey? What does it feel like? How does it look like physically with the infrastructure? Could you take us with your wild imaginings right now?
Yes, of course. I want to start off by kind of picturing what we're in right now, the situation that we are in right now here in Ottawa. Just a few statistics. So Black people are 3 times more likely to die in the hands of police. And as well as Indigenous people are 8 times more likely to die in the hands of police. So we're in a situation where we know the demographics of the city and this country, but Black people and Indigenous people are proportionately more susceptible and bear the violence against police and state violence in general. We're also in a place where 70% of those in this country who die at the hands of the police were in some sort of mental health crisis. So we cannot leave out the conversation to just the identity of Black and Indigenous and racialized people. There are also those who are Black and suffer from mental illnesses. Indigenous people who suffer from mental illnesses, they need to also be a part of the conversation. So when we look at the current state that we're in right now, and we see that Black, Indigenous, and marginalized people are bearing the most violence from police and do not feel safe in these communities. As I mentioned earlier, there is mistrust and distrust between the police and the community. After seeing the many events that not only happen here, but across the world, we saw the death of George Floyd shake the world this past summer. And unfortunately, as terrible as George Floyd's death was, this is happening here in our own communities with the names that I've mentioned earlier, Abdirahman Eddi, Anthony Oust, and Greg Ritchie. So we see this happening in our backyards. So that's where we are right now. Now, if we were to say, what would it be like to be in a safe city? I definitely can say, as a Black person myself, as a Black Muslim woman, what a safe city would mean to me is whenever I do come across police, I don't want to think about what I have to say or overthink it or have to think about whether I've complied enough or did not comply enough. We often see in situations where there is police violence and state violence, a lot of what people have to say is, did they comply? Did they listen to the rules? Did they do this? Did they do that? And there's a lot of pressure laid on those who are on the other side of the police conversation, whereas the police are trained to de-escalate, to make sure that people are okay, to as I said before, protect and serve. Us regular citizens, we're not meant to be on our A game every time we come across police. So in a perfect world, I would hope that if I were to come across police, I wouldn't have to overthink everything that I say, or I don't have to have in the back of my mind that what if I'm next? Because I know a lot of Black and Indigenous and racialized people have that thought of, well, a police officer is coming to me. What if I'm the next George Floyd? What if I'm the next Abdurrahman Abdi? So for us to get to a safe city, we need to understand how can we ease the anxiety and the stress that is on the marginalized folks who feel those emotions and who have those thoughts when coming across police. So we need to hold the police officers more accountable and show a precedent that if a police officer were to engage in misconduct, such as inflicting violence in any way, harming a citizen, or overall just killing a citizen, we need to hold them accountable and hold them to a standard that is not okay. We see time and time again where police officers are barely charged, or if they are charged, they are acquitted, as we saw with the Abdurrahman Abdi case. Here in Canada, since the year 2000, only 2 police officers have been found guilty of police violence, where there has been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases, both reported and not reported. So we need to show that this is not okay, that the Black community, the Indigenous community, and allies beyond do not, will take a stand towards the fact that police can get away with misconduct. And once that is overcome, I can definitely say that we will feel like we are in a safer city.
Thank you, Ifrah. Go ahead, Patricia.
Thanks for those comments, Ifrah, and the thinking about what a safe city might look like in terms of disrupting current police structures and systems, and ensuring that the police, should they exist in that safe city, that we imagine that they're actually serving and protecting all communities, including Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. And you know, that point about the trauma that Black, Indigenous.
Patricia, you're on mute. There you go.
The point with respect to the trauma that generally Black, Indigenous, and racialized people walk around with in this city is very important to underline. And you know, imagining a city where we as Black people, or as Indigenous or racialized people, don't carry that would certainly be a vision for a more just city. So we're moving now to Hayley. Could you speak, Hayley, to how COVID-19 has so starkly revealed this city's many inequities, especially for workers and residents of Ottawa? And I know some of our panelists have already touched on this, but especially for the most vulnerable populations. So people who are homeless or at risk, Indigenous people, women, caregivers, Black and racialized communities.
Thank you very much, Patricia.
Sorry.
So, hello? Okay, so thank you very much. So with respect to how COVID has and how we're dealing with those stressors, I live in a non-for-profit in the co-op sector. And I think what we have seen is that, first off, there is a cachet of 30,000 people on a waiting list currently, waiting for some type of affordable housing. And we have yet to see the government address these issues of building more non-for-profit homes for the less fortunate within our populace. I think most definitely COVID has really highlighted the lack of preparedness, because we should, as one of my panelists, my co-panelists said earlier, the Prime Minister has asked that we all stay at home. But of course, if you don't have a home to stay in, we're seeing that shelters are filled to capacity. We've seen a couple that have been closed. So we need to ask ourselves, where, of course, are these people going to go? So we see the disparities with regards to the different equity groups within the government structure. Of course, we're seeing that the discussion around the 699 code and parents who are now having to stay at home and homeschool their children because they have taken that decision to keep their offspring out of harm's way. And now we see the employers who are not so happy about that and really trying to take away the option from the employee. When you're putting that situation forward, you're looking at this type of situation. It really severely affects women. It affects those parents that maybe have other things that are happening at that time. It affects those within the populace that have disabilities. So we're really seeing that what we have in place right now is really a shortfall to what we should have in place. The structures that currently exist do not address what's happening. With regards to housing, COVID has actually shown us that we need to take a closer look at the guards who are guarding, those people who are in charge of housing, and how really they are attacking the various mixed communities and how they are addressing the needs, the cultural needs as well of our different groups within these mixed housing units. And I think it's important while we go through this pandemic that we constantly try to refocus, to feed into the necessary pipelines that are dealing with these issues. And really, like I said earlier, have those discussions to really make serious attempts to try and address what sits out there. Because as it currently stands, there's a disconnect between the city and the housing sector. They have a set of rules for you, but again, they may not actually work for the entire group within any particular housing scenario. I'm sure Naini has probably some more to add to that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hayley. And thanks for the reminder to really take an intersectional gendered approach to these big issues like employment equity, like housing, to really get at what are the diverse needs in our community and how can we address them in unique ways that really address people's specific and individual needs. So thank you for that. Naini, we have an add-on to that question for you, and we're wondering, can you talk about what should the city be doing specifically to address these inequities? And what is the city doing to make them worse? Does the city need to do more, and what specifically to address the affordable housing crisis and social and community needs?
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, it's been a long day and I, in the middle of it, kind of got confused. So thank you for bearing up with me. I think Hayley pointed out a lot of different issues, and I think certainly before I go on to what the city could do, I just wanted to say that the pandemic, as you pointed out, is showing a lot of the structural and systemic inequities. We have seen that 63% of COVID cases are racialized populations, even though they make only 30% of the population here. And in the racial groups, women are most likely to be diagnosed. And even though they carry the weight of being essential workers and keep the city going during this time. And I also wanted to say that research has shown from what we know that homeless people are 20 times more likely to be hospitalized with COVID and 5 times more likely to die as a result of COVID. And overdose deaths have increased because people are not able to get the supports and have to physically distance, which means using alone. So what could the city do? I think the first thing, of course, is something that should be ongoing is anti-racism, anti-oppression training should be mandatory for all city employees and for organizations that are receiving city funding. And we need to ensure that there's adequate housing for people who are precariously housed. Something we are finding through the COVID-19 response is that there's a lot of coordination happening between the different levels of the government. And this is something that has been needed for years. And we feel that it's really important that we mobilize resources and actions in the same way to respond to the need for affordable housing, healthy food, and adequate income. We also need to ensure, as was earlier on pointed out, about developing models of community safety that do not rely on policing, but are preventative. The other element that's important in responding is increasing adequate and providing adequate financial support for culturally relevant social services, including anti-racism initiatives. And there was a report that was recently published by the Community Health and Resource Centers that showed that Ottawa's most vulnerable citizens are being placed at risk because a lot of the basic services as well as essential social services are being eroded, and funding has not kept pace with the city's growth and also the complexity in needs. And I guess ultimately the challenge is that people who are navigating this crisis comes down to lack of income. So while there might be supports that are being introduced to help workers who are laid off, those on social assistance are still trying to manage in this crisis with inadequate income supports. And when we look at having an anti-oppression framework, I'd like to cite the example of the Ottawa Local Immigration Partnership, which has been serving as a citywide platform to understand since COVID-19 began, to look at the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on Ottawa's immigrants and racialized communities. And to quote one participant, communities are resilient and they can come up with solutions. They just need to be heard. And I think it's important that we look at solutions. And an example of something that was just recently put in front of the council was to recommend 13.2 million be added to the 2021 city's budget for affordable housing and supports. But it was denied by 2/3 of the city council. So what could be done around affordable housing? There's a need to recognize that there's a range of options for affordability. We need rent subsidies, deeply affordable units, not just below market rent, so that those who are living on very limited incomes can afford housing. Cooperative housing, we need more supportive housing for people who are being housed with mental health issues. Indigenous and racialized voices need to be at the table when there are housing models being developed. And we also need to ensure that private market developers set aside units for permanent, affordable, and adequate housing in new developments. Private and non-profit developers need to ensure that there's meaningful consultations where the voices of the people living on low income, those are homeless, precariously housed, are part of the planning process. And we are finding that we need to stop policies which support gentrification. When you have municipal planning or public policies, they're often enacted under the guise of creating new public spaces, or in some cases combating urban blight or bolstering economic development. But over time, these policies have stripped marginalized communities of the financial stability which is found in property ownership and affordable rental housing access and access to public transportation. So right now, with a lot of the new transportation, or with the lines that are being developed, there's a lot of housing that is being developed, but not all of it is nonprofit. And I know that there's a lot of advocacy to ensure that there's a nonprofit housing that is accessible, close to the transportation available. And we also need to ensure that all new development proposals are assessed using an equity and inclusion lens. We need to ensure that there is street outreach, double the number of drop-in centers, expansion of safe drug consumption sites, and a whole host of other supports that are possible. And I think it's just I think it's a lack of imagination and lack of resources when we have a community in which there are disproportionate number of people who are being impacted by our by health crises, and who are struggling in a city that is so rich. We need to look for solutions and hear the voices of the people.
Thanks so much for those comments, Naini, reminding us that, you know, a just city is one where there's income security, where there's affordable housing, where there's, you know, mandatory training, anti-racism and anti-oppression training for city staff, where there's inclusive decision-making, and access to public transportation, and, you know, new models and different models of community safety. I know there is some writing about cities without police. In fact, there are some academics that are writing on those topics in terms of imagining a different kind of city where all are able to participate, engage, and move through the city in safety and security. So we're moving towards the time when we will be opening up questions for the audience. Again, I just want to remind everyone that if you do have questions, please feel free to send those questions, and we will read them out, Valerie or myself. And in addition, we will just remind everyone again that we do have interpretation, sign language interpretation. So we are trying to speak more slowly to accommodate and ensure that everyone is able to participate. So just ending with a question then for Julie, based on what you've heard from the other panelists and your initial comments, what does it really mean to decolonize planning and the built infrastructure, which is too often oppressive? And we heard you comment on that in your opening remarks, really, in terms of imagining a city that has a recognition and value of Indigenous life and contributions in the built infrastructure. So what can the city do to support a process of decolonization and reconciliation? So just let me repeat. What does it mean to decolonize planning and the built infrastructure, which is so often oppressive? And what can the city of Ottawa do to support a process of decolonization and reconciliation?
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot to unpack with these questions. And I want to start with reconciliation. And really just to say that it has been mobilized in problematic ways by the state at all levels, really kind of giving the illusion of change while not doing very much to fundamentally change the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the settler state. So in a sense, the federal government in particular has used reconciliation to resist change, talking about reconciliation while refusing to make change. And just to illustrate, Eva Jewell and Ian Mosby are tracking the implementation of the TRC's, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action for the Yellowhead Institute. They released the report in December to mark the 5-year anniversary of the release of the final report, and they found that so far only 8 of the 94 calls to action have been implemented. Maybe I can say a little bit about what the city is doing before going into what it could do to support decolonization. And without going into much detail, and maybe this is something we can come back to later, Ottawa Public Health and the Ottawa Public Library have worked with Indigenous organizations to develop strategies, and the Aboriginal Working Committee, which is a group comprised of members of local Indigenous organizations and city staff. They've put together a reconciliation action plan, which was approved by City Council in 2018. This plan includes 14 items, many of which are focused on raising awareness and education. It also includes things like the permanent addition of the flags of the Algonquins of Pigwacknagan and the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation Tribal Council flags, their addition to the flags at City Hall. Another item is increasing the number of Indigenous city staff. What's probably significant is that the report recommending the adoption of the plan noted that there are no financial implications. So there's no additional or Indigenous specific funding attached to this reconciliation plan. And I haven't been able to find an update on the implementation after 2018. So it's probably fair to say that it hasn't had a radical or transformative impact. And I'm not saying that there isn't a lot that can be done within current budgets and within current mandates. And I'm also not saying that the changes proposed in the plan aren't important. They are, but what about material changes that fundamentally transform relationships and the relationship between settlers and settler governments and Indigenous people in Ottawa? I think it's more useful to focus on decolonization because it centers the land. And in my comments around sort of what the city could do, I focus on the city of Ottawa, and I think that's what the question does as well. But within a relational understanding of cities, I also wanted to say that we can't really neatly separate the settler state and the city, especially here in the capital, where people enact settler colonialism on a daily basis through the federal government. So there's an important role for people here in all kinds of transformations that are necessary to end settler colonialism. But yeah, among the number of ways in which the city of Ottawa could support decolonization are that it could return city land, city-owned buildings. It could meaningfully engage Algonquin Anishinaabe in decisions about land use and management based on consent. It could make space for Indigenous self-determination and different forms of Indigenous governance. And then there are also many areas where the city could provide more support. All of my co-panelists have noted this. And one of the priority areas really is housing, affordable housing. Indigenous people are overrepresented in the or underhoused population in Ottawa, and this has been identified as a priority by the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition, which was really initially formed around this issue, around the issue of homelessness specifically, almost 20 years ago. So change in the city is about supporting and making space for the leadership of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation and local Indigenous communities and organizations to address the priorities, needs, and the diversity of Indigenous communities. I wonder if infrastructure is something that we can come back to later, just because there would be, I don't want to go on for too long, and I want to focus on planning. I would love to just talk about what it means to decolonize planning when it's often seen as or portrayed as this very technical, technocratic, neutral activity, when its practices are actually deeply political and have operated in the service of the settler politics of improvement and development. So I think it's really important to confront planning as a praxis that has made settler colonialism and racial capitalism real on the ground. Planning in this sense is also directly implicated in an understanding of land as property and land in need of development. Indigenous planning disrupts planning as colonialism, and one of the concrete ways in which the city could demonstrate its commitment to Indigenous people is by prioritizing the Tewan project when deciding on the urban boundary expansion. Many of you have probably read about the proposal by the Algonquins of Ontario to create a new suburb for 35 to 45,000 residents southwest of Highway 417 and Boundary Road. But they need the city to expand the urban boundary. City Council has already decided that that's what they're going to do, but redrawing the boundary to include Tewan would be consistent with supporting Indigenous city making. The few sort of articles that I read about the proposal compared to the ZB development in terms of sustainable mixed use planning. The ZB development, though, is an example of how planning decisions are made that reinforce settler interests. In this case, the vision of late Elder William Commanda to restore access to the sacred site of Asinapka or Chaudière Falls, to free the falls and to build an Indigenous center, to build a park on Chaudière and Victoria Islands. This vision was ignored, and despite legal obligations to the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, since it is unceded territory, the land was transferred, NCC land was transferred to a private developer for a mixed-use development and high-end condos. So it's a problem that Indigenous people are excluded from municipal decision-making, or in some cases, Indigenous planning is criminalized. And 1492 Land Back Lane in Caledonia is an example of how Indigenous interventions to prevent the destruction of land and to challenge dispossession continue to be criminalized. A recent example of how Ottawa criminalizes demands for change was the eviction of and arrest of members of the Ottawa Black Diaspora Coalition, Anishinaabe Land Defenders, and the Justice for Abdirahman Coalition in the middle of the night by Ottawa police assisted by OC Transpo and other city vehicles. And this happened in November. It's so great that Ifrah is on the panel, who of course has more insight into what happened and into the important work and organizing for racial justice and against police violence that they're doing. My understanding from a distance is that protesters peacefully took up space to demand action against systemic racism, and specifically that the city freeze the police budget. Yet city officials framed them as a threat to public safety to legitimize this violent removal of people, including KZ land defenders. So in this city, reclaiming space, politicizing violence, and solidarity are apparently seen as threats, perhaps revealing a lot about the investment in a settler colonial racist social order. I'll leave it here. Thanks.
Valerie?
Oh, okay. Thanks, Patricia. Just lost track of our tit for tat here. Thanks, Julie. That was really great. I think you managed to squeeze a lot in a very short period of time, and I really appreciate you disrupting notions of criminalized behavior in terms of reclamation and decolonization, and how we need to really disrupt these narratives that exist at the city level, but also in the public, right? That instances of reclaiming land, of disrupting narratives, of taking up space, then get criminalized and dismissed. And that's very problematic. So thank you for drawing attention to that. We now turn to the questions from the audience. I see we have one here. Thank you, Jasdeep. So this question is not just for Ifrah, but for everybody, talking about how a large number of the community showed up to the police board meeting to freeze the police budget. And as Ifrah mentioned and others, that did not happen. So what else can the community do to deal with the issues mentioned? And I think in relation to this question specifically, issues of policing and the police budget. I'll open it up. Ifrah, perhaps if you want to start with that, and if anyone else wants to jump in.
Yeah, perfect. I can start off, and if anyone wants to add on to my thoughts, please feel free to. I would definitely say showing up to the police board meeting is one of the many examples of actions that we can take as a community. We as the Justice for Abdurrahman Coalition, we've held several actions, several protests. As Julie mentioned, there was one at the intersection of Nicholas and Laurier, where police officers did end up arresting some of the protesters, and several other actions, and just holding our politicians accountable. We need to make sure that our voices are heard, both online and in person. And, you know, hopefully we can end up one day holding those seats in parliament or in government or in municipal politics to hold some sort of influence. As I said before, it's all about the tone at the top. And those are the people who can change the law, change how we can live in a just world. So we definitely need to just show that we are here, we are loud, and we want a change in our society.
Thank you, Ifrah. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in. Naini, I'm wondering if I could put you on the spot, because you did mention in your earlier comments about the work and the thinking that's happening in the community right now about alternatives to policing so that community safety is prioritized. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Certainly. I guess the first thing I just wanted to say in terms of influencing, it's important to make deputations at, when the city has committees, and talking to, speaking out also to your councillors, because often we see that some of the councillors that are away from the downtown are not supportive of when there are proposals around a more community-based solution. So I think that kind of influence is really important. And I think the approach that we are supporting is that we need to look at how to detask, I guess, the police around mental health crises. And we are saying that that community-based organizations, within them, there's a common understanding of the challenges that marginalized people are facing. And there's a depth of experience in responding to these challenges. And there's less likelihood of negative or fatal interactions with the police services that could happen if those approaches were taken. And there's a lot of, currently, as you've talked about, there is distrust, and it is very difficult to have a successful outcome if there is a lack of that capital in the relationship, and also in terms of the culture of the organization that is looking at how to effectively support the community. It's not about policing. It's about, a lot of the issues are about social justice. We know that it's the determinants of health. It's not about fixing people, but it's about fixing situations. So the narrative has to shift, and the approaches very much have to be around how can there be work in supporting individuals versus and communities versus leading up to the crisis that we see that happens, which leads to these consequences. And there is a lot of different models available. There are approaches where there are multidisciplinary teams which have extensive training in trauma-informed care and de-escalation that could be put into place. There's a lot of work happening in so many countries and across so many provinces where people are looking at how could there be a more civilian-led mental health crisis response that is community-driven and community-based, that could be leading the process, the planning process. And I think for community agencies and for community members, it's looking at how can we influence. We know that there is a proposal on the ground where there is an approach being looked at forming a secretariat similar to the anti-racism secretariat, which could start planning. And it's an opportunity for us from the community to look at how we can influence that and have an alternate way of responding to mental health crises.
Thanks very much, Naini, for the response, and to Ifrah as well. And thank you again to Jazdip for the question. We do have another participant who would like to speak. I believe it is Anna. So Anna, we are going to unmute you so that you can speak. Just to let everyone know again that we are running until 8:30. And we do ask that you ask your question slowly as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I am Ana Falú from Argentina. And I'm really very good, well impressed of this exchange of findings, reflections, and I only want to make a short comment from Latin America. And I would like to say that we are in a very, I would say, in the same page of the same issues and the same thematics that we need to tackle in this pandemic, in this post-pandemic that will come. But there were problems that were before the pandemic that now are more critically being exposed to the society. And I would say that for us, the Latin America, we are very clear that we need to address the political action, the research even, and the activism in terms of diversity and the differences of population and society. And we agree with all your presentations that people or any kind of those neutral categories are useless, and what are doing is omitting social subjects and omitting women and other diversities. Yeah, so we think that, of course, and I will agree with most of you, that what is underpinning is patriarchy, colonialism, and neoliberalism. And this is very critical, this combination of colonialism, racism, and the persistence of the patriarchal the action, sorry for my English, and the neoliberalism economical and financial framework is really critical, it's damaging, and it's predatory for nature, predatory for goods, and predatory for bodies, for the people, and particularly for women's body. And when those women's body are intersection with race or with ethnicity or with poverty, with all of that or many other conditions like sexual identities, those are much more well, in a critical situation, yeah? So we think that there are some issues that are relevant for our discussion, for the discussion on cities, on security, on housing, on common goods, on urban infrastructures, yeah? That is the recognition of diversity, to place inequality in the center of the agenda, and to put in that center of the inequality women, because women in Latin America are the more unequal. Women are, yeah, so we think those are the relevant issues we need to, and I would like to finish with this. We need to collect some profound messages. And one profound message is the message of the mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau. She is saying to the world that we need to feminize politics. And this is a key issue. We need to debate with different stakeholders with this vision, feminize politics, and to explain what means feminism. Feminism is much more than women. Feminism is much wider and broader concept to this new society we have to face. We don't want to come back to normality. We need to build a new normality after this pandemic. And this new
normality. Thank you very much, Anna, for your.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It was so
for your contributions and for your commentary. And as you say, coming from Latin America, specifically Argentina, with your comments on the need to disrupt structures, ultimately, you know, capitalist, neoliberal structures, patriarchal structures, and that's sort of a theme that we hear running through the interventions and remarks of our panelists. But we are moving into the last 5 minutes of the evening, and I know people have had long days as well, and some people even have children still running around. So we have a last question, I believe. It's really to everyone on the panel, but we'll probably direct it to just a couple of people. Some of you have mentioned the gentrification of urban areas in the city. How do you believe we can best stop this practice? And I think I'll turn to Julie, actually, with your experience to start to answer that question, if you can.
You're on mute, Julie.
Okay, I have used Zoom before. I guess my answer would stress again that when we talk about gentrification, we're talking about processes of dispossession and displacement that affect people, different people in different ways. So here, I think we're looking at the broader structural relationships that need to be changed, and it's not in terms of practical kind of city planning type solutions. I would say that it's not really my area of expertise, so I feel I can be more creative in just saying that it is about decommodifying housing and finding ways of doing that.
Thanks very much, Julie. And Naini, and then I think we are going to wrap up with a very last quick question.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and we've been struggling with that. What we have, the path we have chosen just on the ground, obviously I talked about all the different policies that need to be addressed and at a planning level. I guess from a community level, what I can say is we have worked to bring the marginalized voices together to speak out against gentrification. So it's starting the conversation, bringing people together, and ensuring that the voices of the people who are most impacted are taken into consideration when there is planning happening. And then having in our case, we took 3 years to look at our community and have developed some really concrete approaches, including having all the proposals being assessed in a certain way, developing a process through which, if there's any profit or nonprofit developers, to have meaningful consultations and have the voices. We are looking at a land trust that we are developing as well. And I know that you're almost at the end of but anyone who's more interested in having a conversation, welcome you. We have a very engaged group of people in the West Centertown, and we have a whole report on it. It's called Building Communities Together, and I can share it with Valerie, and you can distribute it to your list as well. It talks about the whole project and all our research that we have done over the years. We are deeply distressed by the gentrification that's happening there.
Valerie, over to you. Thank you, Naini.
I'm on mute. Just checking in, Patricia, the last question, or should we wrap up?
I think we should wrap up, but
Okay.
maybe we should just quickly summarize or turn to the comments. People can see the commentary. I hope everyone is able to see the comments that Mo has put there with respect to contributing to Ottawa's official plan, and the fact that there's an opportunity there to send in your own words what you envision for a just city in terms of affordable housing, food security, equity across neighborhoods, instead of have and have not neighborhoods.
Thanks, Patricia. And thank you to all our panelists for such a great, engaging conversation. I found myself very inspired at multiple points over the evening, and I was taking notes and looking forward to continuing to work with all of you to see how we can action these things and continue to mobilize going forward and into 2021. I would also like to thank all of our participants for coming out and joining us. It's dark days still, and it's great that so many of you came out to join this wonderful panel. I also want to give a shout out to our interpreters, Chris and Rosalie. Thank you so much for providing ASL interpretation. This has been my first time participating in a session like this, and I've really enjoyed it. And it's a best practice to continue going forward. We want to thank the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Carleton University for hosting this lecture series and inviting us to curate this one, especially Pauline Rankin, the Dean of Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and Jill Weigel, a CAWI board member and a Carleton faculty in the Department of Geography, who was very keen on having CAWI put something together on the Just Cities. That is all for tonight. And of course, thank you to the panelists for taking time tonight to speak with us and share your experiences and your thoughts. Thank you all, everyone, and I wish you an excellent evening.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.